welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I'm Dale, and I am joined by Christoph.
Hello, Dale. Very happy to be here again, and listener, thank you for being here also for the first time or again. I can't tell. There's so many of you. It's hard to tell who I'm talking to.
All of them at once.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I'll just say thank you.
There you go. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The towering silhouette of a battleship cutting through a gray horizon. Her deck glistens with salt water. Her massive guns, each barrel longer than a city bus, rest silently. Yet they radiate a kind of restrained power. Steel armor, riveted and burnished by decades of sea spray, gleams under a muted sun. That image, that sound, that presence, for generations, it symbolized America's strength at sea. From the USS Iowa to the Missouri and the New Jersey and the Wisconsin, these were the great beasts of the ocean, the Iowa-class battleships, born in fire during World War II and sustained through the Cold War. They were massive, majestic, and, let's admit it, utterly awe-inspiring. But today, those ships are quiet. Their engines are cold. Their decks are lined with tourists. And their great guns point towards peaceful skies. The battleship, once the ultimate expression of naval power, has become a museum piece, both literally and symbolically. And yet, it refuses to die. Every few years, someone, sometimes a historian, sometimes a politician, sometimes even a president, starts talking about bringing the battleship back. It happened again recently when President Donald Trump mused aloud about the idea of a new generation of dreadnoughts, powerful, steel-armored warships bristling with guns, not built for stealth, but for sheer dominance. The notion seems impossible, almost fantastical, in an age of missiles, drones, and cyber warfare. And yet, there's something deeply human about it, something nostalgic, even romantic. It's as if the battleship is more than a machine. It's a ghost, a memory of strength and certainty that still lingers in the collective imagination of the Navy and of the nation itself. Naval scholar and former USS Wisconsin officer James Holmes calls this fascination both weird and eerie. Drawing on the late cultural critic Mark Fisher, he explains that the weird is the presence of something that shouldn't exist, while the eerie is the haunting absence of something that should. When a modern president speaks fondly of 68-foot guns and inch-thick armor in an age of satellites and hypersonic missiles, well, that's weird. When we look out at today's fleet, sleek, fast, but fragile, and realize there are no ships left that could take a punch and keep fighting, that's the eerie. Together, they define the strange pull of the battleship's ghost. So in this episode, we're going to walk the deck of that ghost. We'll explore why the battleship refuses to fade from our collective memory, why that absence says about the U.S. Navy today, and why the very idea of a ship built to both take and give hard knocks still exerts such a powerful hold on the naval imagination. We'll move from nostalgia to strategy, from the roar of 16-inch guns to the silent hum of modern destroyers, tracing the line between history and the haunted present. But sometimes, to understand the future of sea power, we have to listen to the echoes coming from the Age of Steel.
That's awesome. I cannot wait to get into it. I did not go see an Iowa class one. I think it was I don't remember which class it was. but it was the USS Alabama, so it was built right before the Iowa-class battleships. And walking around that deck, let me tell you, that was incredible. And it did pack a punch. Like, you could see it could take hits and keep going. And to have something like that on the seas would be interesting, because there are so many technological advancements that have happened since the 1940s that could definitely make a modern battleship very different, yet still as capable, or even like project the same power equivalently. And gosh, I mean, I played Battleship the game as a kid, and they didn't call it destroyer or aircraft carrier. That was the ship that was the star of the show. And that would be something. I remember many episodes back I asked, why don't we have battleships now? And you said, well, with missile cruisers, that's such a much more effective way to attack from the sea. And I said, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So it'll be curious to see what the pros and cons would be as we discuss this.
The Alabama was the South Dakota class.
South Dakota class, that's right.
When President Donald Trump stood before a group of senior military officials at Quantico, Virginia, and said almost offhandedly, quote, "I think we should maybe start thinking about battleships," it caught people off guard. It wasn't exactly a policy statement. It wasn't a budget request or a call to arms. It was more of a musing, a spark of nostalgia that suddenly lit up a corner of naval imagination that had been dark for decades. The president went on to describe his admiration for the great steel giants of the past. He talked about the USS Iowa, the pride of the Pacific Fleet during World War II, now sitting peacefully in Los Angeles as a museum ship. He talked about watching Victory at Sea, that old black and white documentary series that once defined America's vision of naval power. He even praised the ship's 68-foot long guns, its solid steel armor, and the craftsmanship that made it feel, at least in his mind, indestructible. And then, with his characteristic flair, he added, quote, "Some people would say, no, that's old technology. I don't think it's old technology when you look at those guns." Now, for many people in the Navy or in the world of defense strategy, that comment seemed weird. And that's exactly the word James Holmes used in his article, "The Battleship Continues to Haunt the U.S. Navy." To Holmes and to the late philosopher Mark Fisher, the weird is something that exists out of place, something that shouldn't be there, yet somehow is. A Lovecraftian sea monster lurking off the Massachusetts coast. A ghostly echo in a radio transmission that shouldn't exist. Or a president in the age of satellites and cyber warfare talking seriously about battleships. The weird makes us stop and question what we think is possible or rational. It breaks the frame of what feels normal. Let's face it, the idea of a battleship in the 21st century is weird. These ships designed for a kind of combat that no longer exists. Close-range duels between massive armored vessels trading broadsides of gunfire across the open sea. Each Iowa-class battleship displaced over 57,000 tons fully loaded. Their main guns could hurl a 2,700-pound shell more than 20 miles. They were protected by armor that, in places, was nearly 19 inches thick.
Wow.
Enough to shrug off anything short of another battleship's full salvo. But they were also enormously expensive, manpower heavy, and by today's standards, utterly visible. No stealth, no guided missiles, no electronic warfare suite to mask their signature. And yet, something about them still feels right. Their very presence, that combination of power, beauty, and performance, calls to something deep in the human psyche. Holmes argues that what President Trump was really reacting to wasn't technology, it was aesthetics. He was drawn to the look, the feel, the romance of steel. In an era where warships are built of lightweight alloys, composites, and aluminum, materials that, as Trump himself quipped, melt if they look at a missile coming at them. The battleship stands as a monument to durability. Steel doesn't flinch. Steel doesn't hide. Steel endures. And in a time when the world feels unpredictable, when war has become invisible, digital, and remote, the idea of something as tangible as a battleship feels almost comforting. It's like a throwback to an age when power could be seen, touched, and measured by the thickness of a hull or the size of a gun. That's the weird pull of a battleship. But of course, the Navy isn't blind to reality. Bringing back the actual Iowa-class battleships, those museum vessels, would be practically impossible. They're over 80 years now, and even during their last service in the 1980s, they were difficult to maintain. The engines, the boilers, the fire control systems, all analog, all hand-operated, belonging to another era. Holmes points out that even if you could physically refurbish one, there's a much bigger problem. The people. Who's going to crew it? Who remembers how to operate a 600-pound Bobcat and Wilcox boiler? Or how to align a Mark 8 fire control computer that predates the moon landing? That specialized knowledge is gone, sealed up with the ships themselves, much like the eerie silence of an abandoned cathedral, or as Holmes himself recalls, walking through the USS Wisconsin the day before she was sealed for good. He described it as eerie. No lights, no power, no crew, just the echo of footsteps and the smell of oil and metal. It's the silence that haunts you. So, no one's seriously proposing to haul these giants back into service. But the idea of them, the aura they carry, that's something else. Trump's comments weren't just nostalgia. They were a kind of symbolic critique. A statement about what the modern Navy feels like is missing. And that brings us to the heart of the weirdness. The U.S. Navy, the most advanced fleet in the world, may also be the least physically resilient. Today's destroyers and cruisers, sleek, fast, and armed to the teeth, are made for offense, not endurance. They're built of thin aluminum and lightweight alloys to maximize speed and minimize radar reflection. They're devastating when they strike first, but if they take a hit, they're done. As Holmes writes, quoting Winston Churchill, modern sea battles aren't duels between armored knights anymore. They're duels between eggshells armed with hammers. And that, he says, is the eerie absence haunting today's fleet. So maybe what the president was responding to, knowingly or not, wasn't a military gap so much as a psychological one. A longing for a sense of substance, for ships that could take punishment and still stand their ground, for steel instead of circuitry, for power that you can see.
Man, you brought up so much stuff, my mind is spinning. So let me see if I can go through it as quickly as I can. I think the idea of something with a giant gun on it just fascinates, I'll say, Americans. So the tank, battleship, and then like the A-10 Warthog, right? That's just, hey, let's build a plane around a giant gun and then shoot stuff. There's something undeniable about that. And I think getting a battleship going not, and it's not an either or. I don't think it's steel over circuitry. I think it is both. We don't refit any of the old stuff because you're right. We don't have the know-how to operate boilers and stuff that have been long replaced. But when we talked about the Enterprise and the history of ships named Enterprise, and that was the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, it was just a progression. It's like, hey, how many nuclear reactors do we put on this? Well, it had 8 engines, so let's put 8 reactors, and that was way too much. And so now we just think about it from a battleship perspective. It's like, what are the things that we had a problem with before, and how do we correct that with technology or automation or whatever? I mean, automated firing systems, I'm sure, would simplify the targeting and loading and all that stuff. We could really make a super advanced battleship that could take a punch. And then I keep hearing stuff like, from a throwback perspective, like giant shipping cargo ships. They're talking about using wind power, like sails, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's, I would say, 1500s technology, but way before that. We've been sailing forever. So what's old is new again, right? So I can definitely see a modern battleship that is very well armored, but also very sophisticated and doesn't just have a giant gun, but maybe an array of missiles or anti-drone defenses or who knows what. I'm sure this is a fever dream of some nerd that wants to design the ultimate battleship, and I say that as a self-proclaimed nerd. Not a ship nerd, necessarily, but I do love ships. So, anyway, I would love to see this.
If the weird is about presence, the strange return of something we thought was gone, then the eerie is its mirror image. The eerie is about absence. It's what you feel when something familiar disappears, and its empty space feels haunted. It's the silence after a great ship's engines stop turning. It's a decommissioned battleship sitting dark in a harbor, her decks empty, her guns quiet forever. It's that unsettling feeling when you realize that what once made the U.S. Navy invincible had quietly slipped away. And that's what James Holmes means when he says that today's Navy, for all of its advanced technology, feels a little eerie. Because the one thing it no longer has is armor. For over a century, naval architects understood a brutal truth of sea warfare. If you're going to fight, you're going to get hit. That was the world of Alfred Mahan, the legendary sea power strategist. Mahan wrote that the backbone and real power of any navy lay in ships that could take and give hard knocks. Ships that could both inflict damage and endure it. Winston Churchill, who before becoming Britain's wartime prime minister served as First Lord of the Admiralty, put it another way. He said naval battles shouldn't be imagined as two men in armor striking at each other with heavy swords. Instead, he warned they were like two eggshells striking each other with hammers. He meant that as firepower increased, armor had failed to keep up. Ships were becoming faster and deadlier, but also far more fragile. Holmes argues that Churchill's old warning applies even more painfully today. The ships of the modern U.S. surface fleet, the destroyers, the cruisers, and the littoral combat ships, are technological marvels. They're loaded with sensors, missiles, and electronic warfare systems that can detect and neutralize threats from miles away. But there's a catch. They depend almost entirely on not being hit. Because if they are, they may not survive. You see, the Navy's philosophy has evolved around active defense. Modern ships rely on speed, stealth, and layers of guided missiles to destroy enemy threats before they ever come within striking range. It's a strategy that assumes superiority in information, that you'll always see first, shoot first, and win first. But the trade-off is physical resistance. Unlike the Iowa-class battleships, whose hulls were built of thick steel armor, sometimes nearly 1.5 feet thick. Today's warships are built of lightweight alloys and even aluminum. They're optimized for radar evasion, not impact absorption. They can dodge, but they can't take a hit. As Holmes puts it, absent that passive form of defense, the ability to absorb punishment, modern surface ships depend entirely on active defenses. That makes the fleet fast, yes. Agile, yes. Deadly, absolutely. But it also makes it brittle. And that brittleness, Holmes suggests, is what gives the modern Navy its eerie quality.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fleet that looks powerful, but feels strangely fragile. Think of it this way. When you stand on the deck of a battleship like the USS Missouri, you feel the weight of history. Literally. The armor beneath your feet is thick enough to stop a torpedo. The guns overhead can reach a target beyond the horizon. The air smells of oil and iron. You can feel the permanence. Now compare that to the sleek, modern profile of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. It's beautiful, all angular lines and quiet power, but if you tap your hand against the hull, it's not a fortress, it's an eggshell with a hammer. Holmes recalls walking through the USS Wisconsin just before she was sealed up for the last time. No lights, no power, no crew. He described it as an experience that was both majestic and ghostly. And that's the essence of eerie. A space that's missing something essential. You could almost sense the presence of the sailors who used to fill the steel corridors, the hum of engines, and the thrum of the ship's heartbeat. But all of it's gone. It's the sound of absence. Now take that feeling and scale it up. From one ship to the entire U.S. Navy surface fleet. And you start to understand what Holmes means when he says that something vital has disappeared from the Navy's DNA. That sense of durability, of weight, of staying power. The Navy's ships today are more advanced than ever before, but their strength is intangible. It exists in computers, in radar, in algorithms. Their armor is invisible. And for some, including the author, that invisibility feels less like progress and more like a haunting. It's a strange irony. In an age when the Navy can strike targets hundreds of miles away with precision-guided missiles, the thing it seems to miss most is something it can no longer build. Ships that could stand in the line of fire and endure. That longing, that awareness of what's been lost, is what gives the fleet its ghostly atmosphere. The ships are powerful, but they no longer seem invincible. They project force, but not performance. They dominate, but they don't endure. And in that quiet contradiction between the sleekness of the present and the stability of the past lies the true eeriness of the modern U.S. Navy. Holmes isn't arguing for the literal resurrection of the battleship. He knows those days are gone. But what he's really saying, between the lines, is that maybe, just maybe, something about what those ships represented still matters. Not just in steel and armor, but in mindset. In a belief that the Navy should be able to take a hit, adapt, and keep fighting. That resilience, both mechanical and human, might be what's missing most. And in that absence, that hollow space where strength used to live, that gives the modern fleet its eerie quiet.
You know, you said a couple of things that really got my mind working as to what... So, number one, I'm very surprised. I didn't know that the alloys that are used in modern ships are so light. Like the aluminum and composite stuff, I get it. as to why they do that. And I mean, I asked the same question as a kid. Why is an airplane made of aluminum? It was like, well, that is the perfect material for what we're trying to achieve, and that's flight. And in this case, it's stealth and sleekness and speed. And if you have a lightweight car, for example, you get more miles per gallon. Same thing with a ship. You can go faster on the waves, get in, get out, you're done. I think many of these ships were made in an age where we had such a technological advantage that we didn't have to worry about getting hit. And so if you think about UAVs or satellite imagery or all that stuff, we had such a huge, as the United States, a huge advantage over other navies where we could see them way before they could see us. And the technology they used to rely on seeing us would have been radar. And if we could nullify that, well, then we're invisible. We could attack from anywhere. We could surprise them. It's done. But as other nations catch up, those advantages disappear. And so they can see us. And if they can see us, they can hit us. And that becomes a problem. We're no longer the fast attack, invisible navy that we were. And so we may back up, rely more on missiles, for example. But then anti-missile technology just gets more and more advanced, right? Lasers, anti-missile missiles. So what do? Well, it may be the solution is just get something stout that can have the technologies that we already have developed, but then can take a punch also. So that may be the direction as we face potential enemies with organized navies that are technologically advanced as well.
So the question that lingers, can we bring the battleship back? Could the United States, with all its technological might, its shipyards, its engineers, its memory of steel, actually build a modern descendant of the Iowa class? It's a question that seems to surface every few years. Part nostalgia, part curiosity, part genuine strategic inquiry. Because in an era of drones, lasers, and hypersonic weapons, the idea of a heavily armored warship feels both archaic and strangely appealing. It feels solid, real, and maybe in a world that feels increasingly digital and disembodied, that's exactly why the question refuses to die. Let's start with the simple part. The why not? Bringing back a battleship or building a new one would be an immense technical and financial challenge. Holmes reminds us that the Iowa class, those legendary giants of World War II, were already showing their age by the 1980s, when President Reagan recommissioned them as part of his 600-ship Navy plan. The ships had to be retrofitted with modern electronics, missile launchers, and communication systems. But even then, the cost of operating them was astronomical. Each ship required nearly 1,800 sailors to function, a massive crew by modern standards. The Iowa's main batteries, those awe-inspiring 16-inch guns, needed entire teams just to load, aim, and fire. The guns themselves were mechanical masterpieces, but they were also relics of another era, one where precision came from human skill and analog computation rather than microchips and sensors. And as those sailors aged, so did the institutional knowledge that kept those ships alive.
Yep.
By the early 1990s, when the last battleship, the USS Missouri, fired her final salvo in the Persian Gulf, the Navy had already made up its mind. The era of the dreadnought was over. But if rebuilding an Iowa-class ship is impossible, could we imagine building something new? Something inspired by the battleship's spirit, but designed for the 21st century? A ship that combines heavy armor and endurance with modern technology. Lasers, railguns, hypersonic missiles, autonomous systems. A ship that doesn't hide, but endures? Let's call it, for the sake of imagination, the USS Valor, a neo battleship for a new century. She wouldn't look like the old Iowa. Her hull would be sleeker, her silhouette lower to the water. Her armor wouldn't be thick slabs of steel, but composite layers of titanium, carbon fiber, and ceramic, materials that absorb and disperse energy instead of trying to block it outright. Her guns wouldn't be 16-inch rifles hurling 2,700-pound shells, but electromagnetic railguns capable of firing hypervelocity projectiles at Mach 7. Rounds that hit targets over 100 miles away with pinpoint precision. And her power plant? Nuclear, of course. Not for speed, but for endurance. She could stay at sea for years without refueling, generating the energy to power not only her engines, but her weapons and sensors as well. In theory, such a ship could exist. But in practice, that's where the haunting begins again. Holmes points out that the biggest obstacle isn't imagination, it's industry. The U.S. shipbuilding complex is already struggling to keep pace with the current naval demands. The Navy's stated goal of expanding to a 355-ship fleet has been hampered for years by delays, cost overruns, and shortages of skilled labor. Even our most advanced programs, like the Zumwalt-class destroyers, have faced spiraling costs and design challenges that make any talk of building a super ship almost fantastical. The Zumwalt, for existence, was supposed to be the future of surface warfare. Stealthy, heavily armed, and revolutionary in design. But the program was scaled back after just 3 ships, each costing over $7 billion. If that's the price of a destroyer, imagine what a modern battleship would cost. Tens of billions, perhaps. And for what? For a handful of ships that, while impressive, might be too few to make a strategic difference and too expensive to risk in combat. Holmes warns that the industrial, logistical, and political costs of such a program would be staggering. Even if you could build them, should you? Would they serve a purpose, or simply serve as floating symbols of nostalgia? Still, the allure persists. Because when people talk about bringing back battleships, they're not really talking about blueprints or budgets. They're talking about psychology, about something the modern Navy, for all of its brilliance, may have lost: a tangible sense of durability. They're talking about a ship that could sail into danger, take a beating, and still fight. A ship that doesn't depend on invisibility or distance to survive. In a way, they're talking about the same thing that defined American sea power in the 20th century: presence. The battleship didn't just project power, it embodied it. When one showed up off a foreign coast, its mere arrival sent a message. You didn't have to fire its guns to know what it could do. The sight of those massive turrets and thick armor spoke for itself. And that's something no amount of radar stealth or missile range can replace: the visceral impact of steel. Now, to be fair, modern technology does offer new forms of presence. An aircraft carrier with its air wing of fighters and bombers is still the most visible symbol of American power at sea. But even the mighty carrier isn't what it once was. In an age of hypersonic missiles and precision long-range strikes, some analysts argue that carriers are becoming as vulnerable as the battleships they once replaced. If that's true, then maybe the ghost of the battleship isn't just a metaphor. Maybe it's a warning, a reminder that naval warfare moves in cycles, that every revolution in offense eventually demands a new kind of defense. And maybe, just maybe, the idea of modern armored warship, something that could take a hit and keep fighting, isn't as outdated as it sounds. It might just be overdue. Holmes ends his reflection on a cautious note. He says that while he's all for fitting out a modern day descendant of the Iowa class, the reality is grim. Without a massive national effort, something akin to the industrial mobilization of World War II, it's unlikely that the Navy could ever build such ships in meaningful numbers. But that doesn't mean the idea is meaningless. In fact, in its very impracticability, may be part of its power. Because what the battleship represents isn't just a ship, it's a state of mind. A belief in endurance, craftsmanship, and tangible strength. A vision of naval power that's not just digital or distant, but physical. In an age where warfare has become abstract, fought through screens and data links, the image of a ship made of solid steel, bristling with armor, speaks to something enduring in the human imagination, something that refuses to vanish, even when logic says it should. So could the battleship rise again? Technically? Maybe. Practically? Probably not. But spiritually? It never really left. It lingers, not in our shipyards, but in our stories, our memories, and our sense of what a navy should be. A symbol of power that's not just about destruction, but about resilience. A ghost from the age of steel still haunting that sleek, silent decks of the modern fleet.
I got a question for you. What is the crew complement of an aircraft carrier currently, or whenever you were aboard your ship?
Without the air wing, about 2,500. With an air wing, about 5,000.
5,000 on one ship. That's incredible. All this talk about the financial cost of futuristic battleship and how expensive it is to maintain, I think the best comparison would be an aircraft carrier, right? And I think without the air wing would be a more precise comparison because there's so much more that has to go into fueling and arming aircraft that almost is independent. Like the battleship, of course, wouldn't have to deal with that. But I think we have those, and they do project power, and they are very powerful. And yes, they are potentially vulnerable from hypersonic weapons. But I think we're in an age now where everybody can kind of see all the pieces on the board. And if all the pieces on the board are brittle, what you need is a metaphorical tank, which is what the battleship would provide. If everybody has a brittle egg and you show up with a bowling ball, you're going to win. And it won't take too many bowling balls because you can just tear through cartons of eggs. And I think it's doable. It's just a matter of will. And it wouldn't take that many because I have to imagine active duty aircraft carriers. How many of those do you think we have estimation-wise? Is that 5, 10?
Off the top of my head, more closer to about 15.
15. Okay. And that's encompassing the entire world. Like they're always somewhere, and the globe is a big place. But battleships, I know, if you had 3 of them, like you said, you can strategically place them in places where they would be more effective. And I absolutely think we should do this. I think it would be great. Of course, the technological and budgetary concerns are very abstract, and it's not something I'm willing to help out with, I guess, outside of being a taxpayer. But yeah, I think that's whoever does that next will become a dominant player on the seas.
Well, to counter that, you need to realize how expensive it is to run and deploy an aircraft carrier.
Mm-hmm.
It is so much more staggeringly expensive than for a battleship, right?
Okay.
But to, in this case, bring back an Iowa, refit her, that cost is going to be astronomical in the first place,
Yeah,
right?
that's a bad idea.
And then to put her in her service, the cost is prohibitive. Now,
Yeah.
building a new battleship with all these fancy new weapons, you could do that, but you can do the exact same thing cheaper by putting all those weapons on a destroyer or a cruiser.
Okay.
And you will have less cost for less crew and things of that nature.
So would a cruiser or destroyer as well? I guess it would just be like half a battleship then, right?
Something like that.
I could see that. Oh, also, you brought up the railgun. If you have listener, pause this right now and go to YouTube and check out the slow motion videos of the railguns that they're testing the U.S. Navy. Holy moly, they're awesome. So yes, that we have a couple of those bad boys on there. That would be fantastic. Oh, and then come back here and finish the episode. Anyway, yeah, welcome back.
But yeah, if you're just going on cost, battleships is not going to be worth it. Especially since the weapons keep advancing.
Yeah.
So your armor is just going to have to be more and more. And then it's going to get so much, it's just going to sink.
We could try a Voltron type strategy where we have all these tiny ships that form into a mega ship. Hey, it could happen.
We've talked about steel. We've talked about design, cost, and combat effectiveness. But beneath all of that lies something deeper. Something that has haunted the Navy and maybe the nation since the age of the battleship came to an end. It is not just about the ships themselves, it's about what they meant. Because every ship tells a story, not only of war, but of identity. And few vessels in human history have symbolized power quite like the battleship. For nearly half a century, the battleship stood as the very embodiment of naval dominance. When one appeared on the horizon, it didn't need to fire a shot. Its massive silhouette alone declared command. The battleship was presence made visible, the projection of national will in tangible form. When the U.S. Missouri hosted Japan's surrender ceremony in 1945, it wasn't chosen for its comfort or convenience. It was chosen because of what it represented. That towering wall of armor and guns behind General MacArthur wasn't just a backdrop. It was a statement. The era of American sea power had arrived. That image, frozen in black and white, became more than a record of victory. It became a symbol of authority, of a performance, of a world remade by steel. But power has changed since then. Today, the tools of war are invisible. Silent code, unmanned drones, hypersonic missiles that strike from beyond the horizon. Ships fight without ever seeing one another. And victory, more often than not, depends on information, not armor. It's efficient, it's modern, but it's also abstract. And in that abstraction, something human has been lost. It's part of what Holmes was getting at when he spoke of the weird and the eerie. The weird, the presence of something that doesn't belong. The eerie, the absence of something that should be there. The battleship's ghost embodies both. It's weird because the idea of building one again seems out of place in our sleek digital age. And it's eerie because its absence leaves a void, a hollow space where once stood something unmistakably real. Holmes calls this a kind of psychological haunting. The Navy doesn't miss the battleship's logistics or manpower demands. It misses what those ships stood for. They represented an era when naval warfare felt tangible, when sailors walked among great engines, when a ship's power was something you could see, hear, and feel through the soles of your boots. Today's ships are quieter, cleaner, more efficient, but they're also, in a strange way, less alive. When you walk the deck of a battleship, you could feel its heartbeat, the thrum of the engines, the heat of the boilers, the vibration of turrets traversing into position. It was a living machine, one that demanded respect, sweat, and skill. In that way, it was more than a warship. It was a ritual. Every generation of sailors defines power differently. To one generation, it was the broadside of 16-inch guns. To another, the roar of jet engines launching from carrier decks. And to today's sailors, it may be the hum of servers, the glow of radar screens, the precision of satellite-guided weapons. But even as technology evolves, the need for something solid, something felt, never goes away. Because power in the end isn't just about destruction, it's about presence. The ability to stand firm, to endure, to remind both allies and adversaries that you are there. That's what the battleship did best, and it's why its memory refuses to sink beneath the waves. Holmes, in his closing lines, seems to suggest that even though the battleship may never sail again, its legacy continues to shape how we think about naval power. When modern leaders talk about building stronger, more resilient ships, they're speaking, consciously or not, in the language of the battleship. When the Navy debates survivability, armor, and presence, they're revisiting the same questions that defined naval architecture a century ago. And when we, as a society, look to the sea for reassurance, for the visible signs of strength that defined great nations, it's that same silhouette we picture in our minds. The long deck, the triple turrets, the massive bow cutting through the waves, the ghost of Iowa, the memory of Missouri, the shadow of Wisconsin. In the end, the battleship haunts us not because it's gone, but because we still need what it once provided. A sense of certainty, a sense of presence, a reminder that power, real power, isn't just the ability to strike first, it's the ability to endure. And perhaps that's the true message behind Holmes' essay. That even in our most advanced future, there will always be a part of us looking back, searching for that balance between strength and vulnerability, between past and progress, between what we can build and what we still believe in.
Yeah, I think you said it very well. I think there is a balance that needs to be maintained, and there is something that yearns inside of the American psyche for something like the battleship. And whether that is this modern battleship that we were talking about, or a mega death robot like a Jaeger in Pacific Rim, something that is strong, stout, can deal out punishment but take several hits, I think that is what we're looking for. And I think as everybody starts to be able to see that, like I said, the ships are there, they can be seen, we'll probably move to the hypersonic missile age, but then once you get a stout ship that can knock those guys down, they will have the advantage. Especially if you can run up on a bunch of very brittle eggs and knock them out. Of course, that's one guy's opinion. Who knows? If any decision makers in the U.S. Navy listen to this podcast, let us know your opinion of this discussion, and then maybe we can create the Dale-class battleships.
We've walked the decks of giants. We've felt the weight of steel and the silence of absence. But before we leave this story behind, let's ask one final question. What lessons does the ghost of the battleship still have to teach? Because ghosts linger for a reason. They appear when something important has been forgotten, or when something unresolved still calls for our attention. And the battleship, for all its nostalgia and its impracticability in today's world, remains one of the most eloquent teachers the sea has ever given us. First, the battleship reminds us that power is more than offense. It's not just about who fires first or who fires fastest. It's about who can take a hit and keep fighting. Naval historian Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote that the real power of a navy lies in ships that can both give and take hard knocks. In modern terms, that means designing vessels not only for striking power, but for resilience. Today's warships rely on agility and electronic defenses, systems that jam, intercept, or outsmart the enemy. But they are, as Winston Churchill once said, eggshells armed with hammers. The battleship, for all of its bulk, embodied a kind of confidence, the belief that you could withstand the storm and come out the other side still standing, still fighting. That lesson remains vital even in an age of cyber warfare and long-range missiles. Second, the battleship teaches us about presence, about the psychological power of what can be seen and felt. In diplomacy, in deterrence, visibility matters. A destroyer hidden by stealth is tactically sound, but it doesn't project the same sense of assurance as a ship that dominates the horizon. When the USS Missouri loomed in Tokyo Bay in 1945, it wasn't just a ship. It was an idea made real, the physical embodiment of strength and finality. That's something the Navy still wrestles with today. How to project visible power in an era of invisible threats. The answer may not be a new battleship, but perhaps it lies in designing ships and strategies that carry that same unmistakable presence. Third, the battleship warns us about hubris. For decades, admirals and politicians saw it as the ultimate weapon, the final word in sea power. And yet, history proved otherwise. Aircraft, submarines, and missiles revealed the limits of armor and gunfire. The same thing could happen again with today's technology. No ship, no fleet, no weapon is eternal. Each age of naval warfare believes it has found the perfect balance, until the next age proves it wrong. So perhaps the greatest lesson of all is humility. To remember that strength must evolve, that even the most magnificent machines of war can become ghosts if we stop adapting. Still, the battleship spirit endures. In the pride of sailors, in the discipline of engineering, in the steel gray silhouette that lives on in every museum harbor. When visitors walk those decks today, they're not just stepping into history. They're stepping into an ongoing conversation between past and future. Every echo of a footstep on that cold steel is a question. What does strength look like in our time? And how do we ensure it's not just powerful, but purposeful? The battleship may never sail again, but its lessons remain alive in every naval officer who studies the sea, in every engineer who designs the next generation of ships, and in every citizen who looks to the ocean and feels that same quiet pride. It reminds us that history is never really gone. It lingers, like the sound of waves against the hull, whispering what we once were and what we might be again.
I'm sure whatever we predict will be wrong, just because there's always some disruptive technology that appears. And so the way the Navy operates, like I guess, as you were talking about projecting force, I was thinking about how Commodore Perry opened up trade with Japan from the deck of his many ships with giant guns, and that's not something that you do with brittle little destroyers, no offense to destroyers. Or like if he was on the deck of a submarine, that's not really gonna invoke a lot of fear. I think that's probably a better analogy. Although stealthy and capable, yes, that's great. I can knock out any ship, but that's not gonna show somebody that you mean business. The world needs something to rely on. And I think a tangible manifestation of that would be beneficial. But I do take that with caution because of what you were talking about with the submarine and just how battleships were the end-all, be-all, and it took so long and they were so expensive to make, and then all of a sudden they can disappear just because they meet a couple of submarines, and that's it. And you've lost years of work, millions of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you're using to make that. And all that needs to be balanced. Like, can we make something stout and enduring, but also can counter the things that want to take it out? I think we have smart enough folks to solve those problems. We just need the will and the finances to do it.
And so, as our voyage draws to a close, we find ourselves standing once more on the deck of a battleship. A relic, yes, but one that still commands attention. The sea around us is quiet. The steel beneath our feet is cold. The guns above us, silent, but somehow still alive. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The low hum of memory. The echo of engines that once pushed 58,000 tons of armor across an unforgiving ocean. These ships, Iowa, New Jersey, Missouri, Wisconsin, they were more than just tools of war. They were the physical manifestation of a nation's confidence, the embodiment of an era when might was visible and power had weight. But like all eras, that one ended, not with defeat, but with transformation. James Holmes called the battleship's return to public conversation both weird and eerie. Weird because it feels out of place in a world ruled by precision missiles and artificial intelligence. Eerie because we still feel its absence. A hollow space in the fleet where once stood an unshakable symbol of strength. But perhaps what's most haunting about the battleship isn't its guns or its armor. It's what it says about us. We are a people drawn to presence, to the tangible and monumental, the visible proof of what we believe in. The battleship gave us that, a sense of mastery over chaos, of order carved out of salt water and fire. And even now, long after its mission, it continues to whisper something essential about the human condition, that we crave not just victory, but endurance. The ghost of the battleship doesn't haunt us to frighten. It haunts us to remind us that strength is never static, that the tools we build to project power will always reflect the fears, hopes, and imagination of their time, and that the true legacy of the Navy and of sea power itself lies not in the ships we retire, but in the values we carry forward. Courage, innovation, endurance, and a relentless willingness to adapt. The sea, after all, is never the same from one to the next, and neither is the Navy that sails it. So the next time you stand on a pier and see a gray hull on the horizon, or walk the deck of a museum ship and feel the cold wind move across the guns, remember that you're standing between two worlds, the past that shaped us and the future still being written. Because in every new ship that cuts through the waves, there's a little bit of the old battleship's soul, a trace of its confidence, its defiance, its quiet, unyielding pride. And that, more than anything else, is why the battleship continues to haunt the U.S. Navy. Not as a ghost of regret, but as a guardian of memory.
Well said, my man.
So we're going to end today's episode like we do with every episode with the help of HeroCards.us to honor one of our fallen angels. And today we're going to honor Corporal Delbert K. Sand. His hometown was Mount Ephraim, New Jersey. Served with the U.S. Army, 747th Tank Battalion, 29th Infantry Division. His honors were, he received the Purple Heart. His date of sacrifice was June 16th, 1944. Killed in action in Couvains, Department D.I.D. Esperon, Bassy, Normandy, France. He was 22. Delbert Del Sand was born on June 2nd, 1922. His family home was in the Strawberry Mansion section of Philadelphia. Sand dropped out of high school after his junior year to enter the workforce. While working at the Palace Skating Rink, Camden, New Jersey, directly across the Delaware River from Philadelphia, Sand met his future wife Gladys Bradford of Mount Ephraim, New Jersey. In October of 1941, the young couple married and moved to an apartment in Mount Ephraim. By the time Del and Gladys celebrated their birth of their daughter, Shirley, on June 30th, 1942, the United States' role in World War II was escalating. Del had registered for the draft in June of that year and joined the U.S. Army on New Year's Day, 1943, reporting to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Moved to Camp Bowie near Brownswood, Texas, for basic training. Stant was assigned to the 747th Tank Battalion. The battalion moved to Camp Hood for training, followed by maneuvers and more training at Camp Polk and Camp Swift. In February of 1944, the 747th Tank Battalion sailed for Scotland aboard the USS Charles Carroll, APA-28, in preparation for the June 6th D-Day invasion of France. Each tank crew was ordered to give a name to their tank to use as a quick field identification. The first letter in the name was required to be the same as the company's, which for Sand's crew was H, for headquarters company. The crew agreed to the name Helza Poppin after a popular Broadway play at the time and stenciled the name on both sides of their Sherman tank. At 0700 in the morning of June 7th, 1944, D+1, the 747th Tank Battalion began landing on Omaha Beach. Engineers had laid white tape on the sand to indicate lanes where minefields had been cleared, allowing tank battalions to safely move inland. For the next week, the 747th moved forward into France. On the evening of June 15th, the battalion headquarters received a communication from the 29th Infantry Division requesting a vehicle to take a forward observer up with the infantry to direct artillery fire. Corporal Sant's crew with the Zellepoppen were chosen for the mission. Traveling through the French countryside, they stopped the tank at various spots and provided coordinates to a nearby artillery battery over the tank's radio. After the call was made, the artillery shells fired. Lieutenant in command would verify whether the strike was successful and call in adjustments if necessary, then move on to the next potential target. On a small dirt farm road near Bois de Bretel, just south of Couvains, France, the observation unit was discovered by German defenses. Exposed to enemy fire, the Helzapoppen took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust, a German version of a bazooka. According to Corporal Ted Surozik, a member of the Helzapoppen crew who survived the attack, molten metal shrapnel ricocheted throughout the interior of the tank, igniting flammable material in the crew compartment. The tank quickly erupted into flames. Corporal Del Sant, along with Lieutenant Louis Lindsay Jr. and Private Frank Switzka, did not survive the attack. Corporal Delbert K. Sant was brought home in the spring of 1948 and buried at Locust Wood Memorial Park in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. So, Corporal Delbert K. Sant, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Christoph, get us out of here.
All right. Thank you so much for listening to us, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I always learn something new, and it's so cool. If you want to get a hold of us, there's a couple different ways to do that. You can email us. The email address is usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on X Twitter. The handle is @USNHistoryPod. And we have a Discord server. I don't know if you know this. If you listen regularly, you do know this, because I say this every time. You can find the link to the Discord server in the show notes. You can join. You can speak like sailors do on the Discord server. Also, please rate, review, tell a friend, coworker, congressional budgetary decision maker. Tell everybody and spread the word. That really helps us. Thank you so much for doing that.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.